Story 1. I stopped being able to count after about 110 hours, but I know I went for significantly longer than that. I was out of my medication and got stuck in a cycle of psychosis as I have schizophrenia. After those hours, I began experiencing more severe hallucinations than usual and entered active psychosis. At that point, the police had to get involved and I was placed under medical care. It was the worst 45 days of my life, but I've been doing well for a little over 4 years now. Story 2. I experienced 68 hours of a manic episode. I wasn't tired during that time, but when the episode ended, I crashed emotionally, mentally, and physically. I go through this approximately once every month and a half, and it's never fun. Story 3. I have been experiencing severe insomnia for almost 6 days. I cannot sleep without medication. I have been taking attention deficit hyperactivity disorder medication since I was 6 years old. I was court-mandated to start treatment at 7, but that is a different story that has impacted my sleep cycle. I briefly rebelled against my medication, thinking, I am an adult and do not need to take my medications anymore. I also had a nearly 1 liter a day Mountain Dew addiction during my first year of college. 6 days without sleep passed quickly. I have been back on my medication for 9 years now and no longer drink Mountain Dew. I still go without sleep for 24 to 48 hours once or twice a month, but nothing as extreme as those 6 days. Story 4. 2 weeks. Insomnia is horrible. Stress, depression, and anxiety. It was so awful I thought I would die. Story 5. 50 hours went by, and I was scared to sleep after I started experiencing uncontrollable nightmares when I was put on antidepressants. I then had a psychotic break after I finally managed to sleep. I had audio hallucinations at 24 hours, and after 2 days, I began having actual hallucinations. The thought of going to sleep and seeing what I had been experiencing was even more terrifying. Story 6. I was working 12-hour shifts from 6 at night to 6 in the morning, with a 2-hour drive each way. I could never sleep during the day, so I'm not sure how long I can sustain this. It was enough to make me feel overwhelmed. Story 7. I spent 62 hours awake. I was 15 during COVID-19 and developed a fear of missing out on things. I took caffeine pills and played Dead by Daylight. I only went to sleep because I convinced myself it would be okay, but it felt like heavy chains were pulling me into the bed. Story 8. Over 30 hours. I worked a 26-hour shift and went to bed right after it. I forget how long I had been awake before that. Story 9. About 56 hours. It was finals week, and I was a procrastinator who needed to write a lot of papers. I drank a lot of coffee. The first night of no sleep made me very tired. However, day 2 of no sleep is honestly exhilarating for me. I have tons of energy and get a second wind. The second night is tough. By the morning of the third day, I started feeling loopy. I crashed and ended up missing my Saturday morning work shift, the first time I had missed a shift in 3 years. Thankfully, my manager was understanding. He was mostly worried because I had never been a no-call, no-show. Story 10. Once, I participated in a grueling 72-hour work session, driven by an intense commitment to productivity. It turns out that relying on energy drinks and negativity to impress your superiors is not the right approach, especially when you start hallucinating unusual shapes and figures in your peripheral vision. This experience was a complete disaster, and I would advise against letting hustle culture mislead you into believing that sleep is unnecessary. Story 11. Probably 72 hours because I was admitted to a hospital. Between the illness and all the activity and light going on there, it was impossible. I wasn't even in a room. It was a curtained-off area of a larger room. Story 12. About 48 hours, followed by small patches of sleep here and there for about a week or two. I experienced postpartum anxiety and refused to sleep because I feared for my baby's safety. Story 13. 4 to 5 days. It was overwhelming. All of my disorders decided to act out at once when I realized that I couldn't maintain my high grade point average after a nursing test. Looking back, I see how absurd it was. I couldn't stop my compulsions and rituals after calculating my grade, then experienced panic attacks because I couldn't control anything. I couldn't sleep because of it all. Story 14. I spent 48 hours sharing a hotel room with someone who was extremely sick. I am a very sensitive sleeper, so I didn't sleep for 2 nights while staying with them. However, they didn't really sleep either, so we were suffering together. Story 15. Over 48 hours after I had my third baby, I experienced auditory hallucinations. I felt as if I was in a dream and was about to faint. I went into labor overnight, missing a night of sleep, and the following night I couldn't sleep because he kept choking on phlegm that came up while he was sleeping. Story 16. About 42 hours, but at several different times. In the oil field, sleep deprivation seems to kick in around 32 hours. Ask me how I know. Story 17. I worked for 56 hours, had a part-time job, and a girlfriend who lived an hour away. There were no drugs involved. I was just a glutton for punishment. I was driving home around 3 a.m. when the divider lines in the road began to wiggle. I did not follow them, finally made it home, and slept for 17 hours. Story 18. I was up for a little over 7 days once about 15 years ago. I was 19, making very bad decisions, and it was because of MDPV, also known as bath salts. I am thankful I was able to break away from that scene. Story 19. 72 hours. My cousin and I were having a competition to see who could stay awake the longest. You start to hallucinate. Story 20. During one very intense final week of a semester, I took 20 class credits while also working. I woke up at 6 a.m., did class work until my shift at 5 p.m., came home and pulled an all-nighter, then went to class to take finals, and worked again at 5 p.m. It was brutal. Story 21. 55 hours. My friends and I wanted to see how long we could stay awake when we were in middle school. By hour 40, we were completely delirious. Story 22. About 40 hours were spent working, with approximately 36 of those hours dedicated to a significant project deadline and visits from very important persons. In the midst of this, I had to drive a colleague to the emergency room because he injured his hand. Story 23. 5 to 6 days. I consumed a small amount every day and sometimes just lay down for about an hour to relax my back muscles. Besides the auditory hallucinations, I felt pretty normal. Story 24. 72 hours, early 20s, working on the ship's bridge. No meth involved. As soon as we made port, I went to my bunk and slept for at least 10 hours. This was in 1994. Story 25. Just under 40 hours. I used to work in a call center, taking night shifts, and I usually tried to enjoy the day with friends instead of sleeping, especially on my day off. Story 26. About 52 hours. Flying home from Ouagadougou on an indirect route because my boss was unwilling to pay for a more direct flight. Story 27. 3 days plus a bit. The reason was amphetamines and being a curious kid. I don't regret it. That first high was so euphoric and warm, almost like an opiate. Shortly after, I was diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, which made sense because it calmed me down while speeding everyone else up to a very high degree. Story 28. About 40 hours. I was working, then had to handle family responsibilities, and then returned to work for the night shift. Story 29. 4 days. The first time I experienced that, I was in an abusive situation, and my needs were not being met. I don't want to explain the second time, but I can go 4 days without sleep if I do not take a sleep aid. Story 30. About 3 days when I was 16. The first day was filled with anxiety because I was flying back to my mom's from my dad's, as I am scared of heights. The second day was exciting because I had returned to my gaming computer after a month. The third day was special because my best friend came over and introduced me to the game Slender, and we spent the whole time taking turns and strategizing to try to beat it. After that, we crashed for about a day, which my mom later revealed would have worried her if we weren't both snoring so loudly that she knew we were alive at all times. Story 31. 33 to 36 hours. If my sleep cycle gets out of sync, I try to stay awake for one night and then go to sleep earlier the next night to reset it. Story 32. About 36 to 38 hours. Because my son was awake and needed parenting. He was on a medication that severely disrupted his sleep, even though his doctor claimed it wasn't a known side effect. In reality, it was well known. His doctor was simply incompetent. Story 33. 72 hours or so. 30 or so hits of LSD. It was fun, but after that long of tripping, you wonder if you will be sane again. Story 34. 56 hours. I used to work at a youth camp, and we experienced an outbreak of norovirus. We had to stay up with the kids until they all went home, disinfect the entire camp, which spans 620 acres, set up for the next group arriving, and debrief the event. Never again. Story 35. I went for 4 days without sleeping to file a motion to oppose the summary judgment. I won the motion, but it took several weeks before I felt normal again. Story 36. 40 hours. On Disneyland's 25th anniversary, they had a 25-hour event that I attended. Started after my day at school, followed by work. Never again. Story 37. A little over 72 hours. No medications, just an extremely bad and long flight experience. I landed around 7 a.m. and still couldn't lie down until that night. Story 38. When I was about 15, my high school held a 40-hour wake-a-thon, where a group of us stayed overnight and had access to various rooms in the school with different student-led activities to help us stay awake. It was a fundraiser for something I can't quite remember. Looking back now as an adult, it's surprising that anyone thought it was a good idea and that it was allowed to happen. I remember coming home from the bus the next day and going straight to bed, and I slept for 17 hours that night. In college, there were weeks of all-nighters, but during those nights, we would usually take 1-hour power naps every now and then. Story 39. About 30 hours. I woke up at 12 o'clock, started working at 1400 hours, finished at midnight, and then drove 1,000 kilometers to my vacation destination for about 8 to 9 hours. I arrived at 9 o'clock and went to bed at 1800 hours. I was visiting my parents, so I spent some time talking to them. Story 40. 36 hours. I got overly excited for a trip and couldn't sleep. I crashed in Playa del Carmen at 8 p.m. and woke up at 10 a.m. I felt like $1,000,000. Story 41. 3 days ago, I brought ecstasy at a jungle rave in San Cristobal, Mexico. I am now 99% sure I was sold meth. Story 42. I was traveling a long distance and had insomnia the night before. By the end, I was almost incoherent. I slept for 14 hours straight afterward. Story 43. 3 days ago, I was angry and confused, experiencing a heightened emotional state. It made sense to me at the time. I often react out of anger when I feel overwhelmed and struggle to express or understand my emotions. Story 44. It was 2 or 3 full days of sleepless nights due to Adderall. It was absolutely hell. I was an emotional wreck. I don't remember much except feeling completely insane. Story 45. Like 24 to 30 hours when I was in middle school, I think I just watched Netflix until it got too late. I can't do that anymore. I'm out the second I am under the covers. Story 46. I had an assignment to submit on Sunday, and I had already completed it. However, on Saturday after 2 p.m., my teacher gave us the instructions on how to do it. There were no prior instructions. I took it very seriously because without board exams, the marks from that assignment would contribute to my final grade. So, I spent the whole night working on it, from 3 p.m. on Saturday to around 9 or 10 a.m. on Sunday. My online class started at 8 a.m., so I stayed awake to mark my attendance. I could have slept after 1 p.m., but I couldn't even fall asleep. I felt so awake and energetic. I stayed awake the entire day on Sunday and didn't sleep until after 12 a.m. on Monday. In the end, my sacrifice went to waste because the board exam happened anyway. Story 47. 5 days. I was looking after the house for my parents and was afraid it would catch fire at night. It was awful. I wouldn't recommend it. The Friday at school was a disaster. Story 48. During my senior year of high school, I spent 30 hours on my own, staying up to catch up on homework while also working. I ended up falling asleep in the middle of a conversation with someone. Story 49. Around 28 to 30 hours that day, my well water system failed, including the pump, pressure tank, and some of the pipes. I worked the night shift, but that day I was off the night before. I woke up early in the morning, thinking I would get a nap later. Unfortunately, that did not happen. I came home and tried to take a shower, but there was no water at all. The pump and pressure tank were from the 1960s. The tank rusted through, damaging the pump. Fortunately, it is a jet well pump, but I had to modify the original setup to fit my new equipment. Story 50. Night flight from Maldives to Singapore, followed by a night flight the next day from Singapore to Sydney. I don't sleep on planes and didn't want to disrupt my sleep cycle by napping during the day. Totaled about 50 hours. Story 51. I would regularly go 24 to 48 hours while caring for my child. He required round-the-clock care and didn't always have home nurses. Story 52. 4 days. Do not recommend Coca-Cola. It can be quite addictive. My nose has never been the same, but I have been clean for over a year now. Story 53. I do not recommend this experience. The worst month was when I accumulated only 23 hours. Please do not follow my example, as this ultimately led to me dropping out of college. Story 54. Just about 2 days. No other reason than being a teenager hooked on the internet and having to go to school the next day, then staying up until early morning again. Story 55. I went for 2.5 days. Side effects included feeling very tired and a need to eat a fourth meal around 3 a.m. Story 56. After 2 days, I became scared to sleep because I know I have nightmares when I sleep after staying awake for a day or two. I couldn't sleep on the first day because I felt sad, but by the second day and into the third, it was the dread of knowing I would be scared during my sleep. Story 57. Just short of 5 days by a couple of hours. It was not a fun time. I was so stressed and depressed, overworked. Hearing voices is putting it lightly. Oh, and did I mention I was still encouraged to drive the forklift at the home renovation store? Story 58. I am not entirely sure, but I believe it was 4.5 days. I experienced toxic psychosis from a quinolone, ciprofloxacin reaction and begged for sleep. Doctors tried Ambien and large amounts of Valium, but the medication just needed to leave my body. I am certain it would have been worse if I hadn't been on intravenous fluids and furosemide to help eliminate it. Story 59. I normally find short-term gigs or roles with a few hours per week, but last year I was offered some better positions. One role was from 2:30 a.m. to 11:30 a.m. Another was from 2:30 p.m. to 4 p.m., which paid a 3-hour minimum, and another from 6 p.m. to 11 p.m., which included generous gratuities. I slept 2 hours at night and 2 more during the day, every day for 7 months straight. The gigs ended, and I returned to my limited opportunities for 4 months. 2 months remain. No regrets. The income during that challenging schedule put me ahead. I don't know how I managed it. Story 60. Power outage in Southern California about 15 years ago. I had worked a full day and then had to help close 10 locations. I had to stay awake in case the power came back on, which I think it did around 11 p.m. After that, I had to get the 10 locations closed and then open them again. Yes, this is related to computer and point-of-sale systems in the restaurant field. All the stores were extremely busy since most places had no food available. So, I guess it was like 36 hours? Story 61. I experienced about 6 days of micro-napping, where I would be briefly unconscious with my eyes open. I wasn't sure why this was happening, possibly due to stress from school. I visited the campus doctor who prescribed medication to help. After taking a pill at home, I slept for 18 hours, woke up for 4 hours, and then returned to bed for another 12 hours. Story 62. I don't know the exact amount, but it was during finals in design school. The last 2 weeks of each term were brutal, with many all-nighters and full days of reviews. At the end of a particularly tough term, I took a 13-hour flight. I used to be a nervous flyer, so I couldn't sleep. At some point, while sitting in baggage claim, I could no longer focus my eyes or think straight. Story 63. One day, I was having a strange day where I blinked rapidly, which kept me awake, and I experienced diarrhea. Story 64. Somewhere around 36 to 48 hours. I stayed up all night binge watching Netflix and repeated that the following night. I ended up crashing at noon and slept until 10. If anyone wants to figure it out, I woke up at 8 p.m. on Friday and didn't go to sleep until noon on Sunday. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.